Good morning. This is the second class. We'll now be talking about tomato gardening. And I'll just put it up on the screen here. Just to remind you, this is being recorded, but actually it's a recording you'll be hearing, so not to worry. So tomato gardening in Marin County. Just again, I'm a Marin Master Gardener from 2012 to 2020, and then in Washington State, 2022 to the present. I have had vegetable and native plant gardens, Marksboro, Tiburon, also in Seattle and Bellevue, Washington. And I teach master gardener classes, fire-resistant landscapes, spring, summer, and winter vegetables, tomatoes, asparagus, and I forgot citrus. So let's start. What are we trying to accomplish with this class? I'd like you to understand the basic principles of tomato gardening and the trade-offs, and learn how to plan and plant a tomato crop, learn how to care for them, harvesting and storage, and problem diagnosis. The context for this, again, is a sustainable gardening approach, which you could net out to. We're trying to minimize the use of chemicals and fertilizers and maximize our ability to preserve our natural resources and maintain plant and diversity health. And this is occurring during climate change. And so your tomato gardening is affected by climate change. And there'll be a couple specific points where I'm going to say, watch for this, watch for that. But overall, what we need to be very aware as master gardeners, particularly when you're working in any sort of help desk mode or at an event or with the public on the help desk itself, is we might begin to see new problems we haven't seen before. So you have to be current with the science, paying attention, because we may end up changing practices over the next 10 years. In fact, I almost guarantee you we will. So tomatoes are part of the Solanaceae family, which is the nightshade family, which includes bell and chili peppers, potatoes, eggplant, tomatillo, and tobacco. The reason you need to be aware of this is when we get to crop rotation, rotating within a family does you no good, because these vegetables and the Solanaceae family tend to have similar diseases and insect problems. So if you just swap these out in the same area year to year, you'll be continuing the problems that you've had. So we'll get to that on crop rotation, but this is the family. There are a series of sort of splits that I need you to get into your head, because when you're trying to help people or you're trying to do this yourself, these take you down different paths. So the first split is, does someone want to grow heirlooms or hybrid tomatoes? If it's an heirloom, that means open pollinated. You can save the seeds from year to year, and they're valued for their taste. If it's hybrid, they've been crossbred, so you can't save the seeds. And usually they've been created for a particular purpose, which could be disease resistance or shipping or long lives on a shelf. So these tend to be two different decisions someone can make. The second decision that someone can make is between a determinant and an indeterminate. Now, determinants were developed so that farmers could have a crew or a combine come through a field on a given day in the summer and pick all the tomatoes, and everything was uniformly ripe and at the roughly the same size. These tend to be bush tomatoes, smaller in form factor, and they push a crop out. Now, there might be a second crop later, but it's primarily a one push thing. And it's great for agriculture because you can schedule it. You know when roughly X weeks in advance you're going to be in the field harvesting this tomato crop. An indeterminate is different. Once you plant it, it starts going to flower. It continues to go to flower for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you can have a crop that starts at the end of July that you're still harvesting in October. And they tend to be bigger plants. So, and this, by the way, this determinate, indeterminate has nothing to do with size or hybrid versus heirloom. These are two different approaches. Um, the indeterminate almost always needs scaffolding because they grow taller and they have a longer harvest cycle. And so you're harvesting some of the tomatoes at any given time, but not all of them because they're in this ripe to unripe stage. Oh, one last thing here. People who have containers or are in contained small spaces, determinants tend to be a better solution because it's physically a smaller plant. People who have more space and trellising, an indeterminate does well. Both can be done in containers, but an indeterminate needs much more space. Another thing to bear in mind is when you look at a seed packet, it will have something called DTM or days, and which is measured when the plant is planted into the ground. So if you start a plant from seed in a cup and then transfer it, this is how long from that point of being transferred as a start before they would expect the harvest. This is wildly unpredictable. This is a shot. If you had perfect conditions and nothing changed, this is roughly when it should happen. Um, it is indicative, though, and I'll get into this more later, of how long it's going to take before you can harvest. And the longer it takes to harvest, the more risk you have as a gardener. So there's a point to having some shorter days to maturity varieties, mid-range and long, so that you're starting to see some tomatoes in July, more in August, more in September. And the days to maturity are the thing to watch. But it doesn't mean the days from when you put the seed in the cup with the soil. It means from when you transplant the start into the ground. So fruit types, they're small, salad, standard, beefsteak, paste, and currant. This spectrum, again, the larger the fruit, the longer it takes. And so if you are in a cooler climate, you will want shorter days to maturity, so you have a better chance of getting fruit during the summer. There are also some specialties like the paste tomato, the San Marzano, and others. These grow for a very specific purpose. Or, for example, the standard size or the salad, these are ones that most people can grow. Beefsteak takes some work. It's larger. Likewise, currant are smaller than cherry tomatoes, have very intense flavor, but they're kind of a pain to harvest because they're like picking berries. So when you're talking to someone, your splits were, do you want heirloom or hybrid? Determinate or indeterminate, and now fruit types. Overwhelmingly, in tomatoes, place drives choice of plant. The first question to ask someone is, what is the climate where you grow your tomatoes? And in Marin, we break them into two camps, the warmer climates, the hot climates, and the cool coastal climates. Then the question is, where are you planting them? In ground, raised beds, or containers? Then what size of tomato are you trying to grow? And then what type? You have these four sets of questions, though in fact, most of the time when people approach me, they start with, I want to grow heirlooms and I'd like to grow beefsteaks. And oh, by the way, I'm doing them in containers on my deck and I only get 4 hours of sunlight. We'll get into this. But if you understand these four variables, most importantly is climate. What's the climate where you're growing the tomatoes? So, for example, let's take 20 different varieties of tomatoes. And this could be similar to the chart that you're going to get for the tomato market each year. You'll have a list of tomatoes and you'll be able to see, I'm sorry, I have this Zoom thing in the way. Some do well in containers, some do well in coastal cool climates, some are heirlooms, some are hybrids, and then they have sizes. So I create a chart like this, or you'll get one from the tomato market. And this gives you a set of choices to make. So, for example, if someone lives in a coastal cool climate, like Mill Valley, like West Marin, then you want to say, out of this list of 20, here are the 3, 6, 12, I think 9 or 10 or 12 that do well in coastal cool climates. So let's focus there. It doesn't mean you couldn't grow a hot climate tomato. The question is, can it fully ripen? And we'll get to full size. So the trade-off between coastal cool and warm climate tomatoes in a coastal cool climate is ripeness and size. The second thing someone might say to you is, because you've asked them, oh, I'm growing in containers. You go, okay, of that coastal cool climate list, here are the 7 that do well in containers. Now you constrain the list further. But now if you notice, there's some cherries, there's a beefsteak, and there's some medium-sized tomatoes. And you have a choice between heirloom and hybrid tomatoes. You've covered pretty much the waterfront of what people might want, but what you've gotten them to do is focus in on where they're growing, coastal cool, and in a container, not in ground or raised bed. In any given zone, for that zone, everything grows in a raised bed or in ground. It's the container that constrains your list of tomatoes. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So the next thing is when you're thinking about in-ground or raised beds or containers, they all have different strengths and weaknesses and issues for growing tomatoes. So the picture on the left is a traditional in-ground with straw mulch between the rows. Raised beds in the middle, you'll notice it's a wood form and plantings, and then a row of containers on a deck. But before we get into that, the most critical thing about growing tomatoes is what you're really doing is growing a root system. So let me explain. This research is, believe it or not, from Russia, where they like to grow tomatoes, but they have a very short growing cycle. So in the left picture here, 4 weeks after a start has been transplanted into the field, this is in ground, it has a root structure that is about 3.5 to 4 feet wide by a little more than 2 feet deep. At 10 weeks, 6 weeks later, it's 2, 4, 6, 7 feet wide and 4 feet deep. And this is because the tomato is looking for water and nutrients. And it's very efficient at growing roots at the beginning of its life cycle to create the nutrient mass it needs to then grow flowers and fruit. So when you're thinking about a raised bed or a container or in ground, the more space the tomato has to spread out, the healthier. So by definition, a raised bed can be pretty close to the same as in ground, but a container is a very different thing. So the varieties that are designed for containers grow more efficient root systems, but less extensive. Soil amendments. Compost and organic 555 fertilizer are essential. because tomatoes are very heavy feeders. So when you're preparing your soil, you want to have taken out in the fall your old plants. If you wintered over with a cover crop, great. You need to have cleared that out about a month in advance of planting. You want to have put in a layer of compost and let it sit for 3 or 4 weeks. And then when you go to plant, put and check the quantities on the fertilizer that you've bought. But when you go to put the plant in, put a tablespoon or whatever underneath the plant between the bottom of the plant and the roots going out, and mix it into the soil so that the roots are growing out into the fertilizer space where the nutrients will be. And then, depending upon how your garden's configured, you'll want to put mulch on top to reduce weeds and preserve moisture. So the order of battle is a month in advance of planting. Make sure you've gotten rid of all the weeds, put in the compost, and do not turn the soil. Do not double dig. You don't want to destroy soil structure. When you plant, add fertilizer at the bottom of the hole and mix it in, and then cover the bed with mulch if you want to reduce weeds and preserve water. So this is very critical because no one's soil is perfect. And this boosts the nutrient value right before you plant. Now, tomatoes can be really wonderful plants. They can also be a shade wall that blocks the sun getting to the plants behind them. And they can also, if you plant 2 rows of tomatoes, the front row can block the back row. So if you're planting 2 rows, you want it to be on the north side of the garden. So if you have southern sun, the rest of the garden is to the sun side of the tomatoes, or on the west side, so that the garden is between, the rest of the garden is to the west of the plants. You want to stagger them so that your tomatoes don't line up perfectly and the back row doesn't get any sun. You want to snip off the bottom branches of the start so that 50% of the plant is going to get buried underground. You want to lay out your irrigation and test it after you've planted, put in your scaffolding and stake your scaffolding down so that you make sure that you don't puncture your irrigation while you're putting in your scaffolding, and you don't put the scaffolding through the root system of a plant. So some people put the plants in and then wait to put in the irrigation, or wait to put in the scaffolding. And the problem is then there's a high probability of you causing a downstream problem. So what does that look like? Here's a normal start. It's about 8 inches tall. You're going to plant them 24 inches apart if they're determinants, 36 to 48 inches apart if they're indeterminates. You're going to stagger the rows, and you're going to pinch off these lower branches. And this plant is that brown, the picture here, this picture right here is this plant planted. So half to 2/3 is underground. The reason you're doing that is if you look closely at the stalk, the cilia on the stalk then becomes roots. So what you're doing is you're immediately doubling or tripling the root mass of the plant at the beginning. Now, if you get one of these plants sometimes where they're 12 or longer inches, you can pick off the lower branches, lay it on the side in a trench, and that will all become roots. The trick is make sure you remember how you did that so that when you put the stake in, you don't put the stake through the stem of the plant. In containers, big is better. 5-gallon is the minimum. I've done 15. The plant will take advantage of as much space as you give it, You want all of them to have drainage holes. And plastic means that you won't have as much evaporation. Terracotta and wood evaporate more. And I have in the past put plastic pots in terracotta pots so that you have the water being kept inside with the plant and you have the aesthetic of the outside terracotta or wood planter. But to optimize for how much water you have to use, plastic doesn't evaporate as much as other surfaces. The other reason you want drainage holes, but not the dishes, is tomatoes don't like wet feet, meaning their roots being wet. So if you are going to put them in a container, you want the water to drain away from the plant and the base of the container. And this brings us to irrigation. This is a rough scale, and you should pay attention as you move from left to right. At the beginning, in the first 3 or 4, 6 weeks of planting, you may be irrigating 3 times a week. You want the soil moist. It helps the nutrients transfer into the plant. But at some point, the plant starts to flower. And if you're buying a plant that's already flowering, I would suggest pinching it off until the plant's grown bigger. Because once it starts to flower, it's going to optimize for fruit production rather than plant growth. Once it starts to flower, you start to back off on the watering a little bit. So you go from 3 times a week to 1 to 2 times a week. And once you're in fruit, you're at once a week. What you're doing is you're stressing the plant. And as it goes to fruit, as the water becomes less available, it puts more effort into having the fruit because it's a survival mechanism. But the other thing it does is it increases the flavor of the fruit by having less water. So you're going to go from 3 times a week to 1 to 2 times a week to once a week. And you just have to pay attention watching your plants. Where are we in the cycle? Now, if you're in containers, you might have a variation on this, which is you might be watering more frequently, but shorter durations, because once the water starts flowing out the bottom of the container, it's not doing you any good. So to conserve water, you might water more than 3 times a week at the beginning, but for much shorter periods. So just play with this. If you're in ground or in raised beds, this sequencing works. Once you go to containers, you need to, at the very beginning, start with how long can I run my water and how are my plants looking? Now, the other way to think about this is if you walk out at midday and your plants are drooping, don't worry about it. If you get up in the morning and they're drooping, they're not getting enough water. If you see a lot of cherry tomatoes splitting, they're either on the plant too long or they're getting too much water. So there are a bunch of problems within the watering space that just mean pay attention and deal with them as they arise. Was that okay? Okay. Now, scaffolding. In Marin County, in July and August, you can have windstorms. And if your scaffolding is not secured, your entire tomato crop can get blown over. It's happened to me. So I tend to have scaffolding that goes up 6 feet from the ground because I tend to grow indeterminates. I tend to have rebar into the ground and then attach my scaffolding, and I use basically it's called hog wire, but it's 4x4 squares. And you buy a 6-foot stretch, loop it around, tie it off, and now you have a cone that's 6 feet tall, about 3 feet in diameter. It's plenty of size for an indeterminate tomato. And then you put rebar and attach the cone to the rebar. You can also buy these triangular things They tend to be shorter than I like. And in either case, the difference between tomatoes and, say, beans, beans have hands. So beans will go up a scaffolding and attach themselves. Tomatoes don't have any hands. So you need to tie them up as you go. And a figure-8 knot where you've got, it's around the stake or the edge of the tomato cage, and then it's looped around the plant, and it needs to be a somewhat loose loop, A, because the plant's growing, and B, because it needs to move a little bit in the wind. So if you tie it tight, you're constraining the plant, and that will come back to bite you when the stalk gets bigger and now it can't grow anymore. So this is a really important part, scaffolding and tying. I go out once a week with my string or my ties, and I just look at every single plant. And it's funny, in a week, a branch will have grown that you didn't see last time that needs to be tied up so that it's attached to the scaffolding. And you just keep at it. Now, tomatoes are self-pollinating. What that means is the flowers contain both the male and female parts, and they are vibrated by either wind or bees in order to release the pollen and have them move within the flower. There's a very specific frequency that this occurs at in terms of pitch. And if honeybees are unavailable, then bumblebees and other species can do this. We have had some seasons in Marin with pollination problems, either because something's happened to the bees or it wasn't windy. So if you get to July and your flowers are browning and falling off, that's because of a pollination problem. And there's not a lot you can do about it. So if the temperatures get too high too early, that affects the pollen. Humidity can also affect the pollen. But if you see in this photo, this brown flower, that's an unpollinated flower. That's your problem. Now, pruning. We used to talk a lot about pruning tomatoes. And as you'll see later, the science is starting to tell us be conservative on this. So here in this picture, this is the main stalk. Here's a branch with a leaf, and in the elbow of the branch is a sucker. So these are what you do pinch off. That's it. Unless you have a tomato plant that's growing out the top of your scaffolding to where you can't reach it anymore, in which case you may want to top it. But otherwise, you want the leaf canopy because it transfers sun into energy and sugar for the plant, and it shelters the tomatoes and it reduces sun scald. So if you over prune your tomato, it reduces the energy that it's receiving and increases sun scald. So it's just something that's changed in the last 10 years. Likewise, harvesting. Truly, the only way to know if you have ripe tomatoes is to go out into the garden and taste them. Saves a lot of time. So I start sort of hovering 60 to 85 days after the seedlings go in and looking for how they feel in your hand and whether they just fall off into your hand when you grab them. If you start to see cherries cracking, they've been on the vine too long. But by and large, I just look for the color, the feel, and whether it just comes off in your hand on the vine. So let me do a brief diversion. I think the reason people grow tomatoes, and it's very popular, is they like the flavor of a fresh tomato. And if you get this question, it's a complicated question. And the research has only started in the last decade into this area, but let's talk about it. So what is flavor? Flavor is the taste in your mouth and throat of what you're eating. And olfaction, which is the sense of smell. And I would also argue how it looks. So what happens is the taste and the olfaction, your brain is connecting the two and saying, oh, this is this flavor. But it's happening because of different inputs. Now, the problem is that most breeders focus on yield, disease resistance, and firmness, which are essential for shipping, and didn't care about flavor. And only in the last decade has the growth of heirloom tomatoes has happened. Mainstream big ag is trying to understand how to have a more flavorful tomato. There's just one problem, and this is this wonderful article in Science magazine. Preference tests, you give a group of people the same tomatoes from the same place. Men and women don't agree. Foodies and non-foodies don't agree. Older and younger people don't agree. And the same fruit in different regions, people don't agree. And so the science is limited because of the nature of the people who are testing. But what we can generalize about flavor-driven fruit selection is the smaller the fruit, the higher the flavor. And specifically in the case of cherries, it's because of the sugar content. So you can look at a cherry tomato and a beefsteak, and a cherry will have higher sugar content. The color of fruit, the research is not clear on that it actually changes the taste, but it changes what you see, and that may change what you think you perceive. Foliage is hugely important because that's what captures sunlight. So plants with dense, healthy foliage can convert more sunlight into sugar and other flavorful components than one with less foliage. They suspect this may be one of the reasons that heirlooms are more flavorful because they tend to have more leaves. And then within hybrids itself, smaller fruit and determinants seem to have more flavor than larger fruit and indeterminates. So how do you grow a flavorful tomato? You want very rich soil, compost with potassium and sulfur added. You want to water sparingly, because remember, the more water in the fruit, the less flavor. The more sunlight, the better. And you want temperatures between 80 degrees in the day and 50 and 60 degrees at night. This is not something you can control. But if you know you're going into a heat wave, you might want to put out either patio umbrellas or shade cloth for your afternoon sun, which is the most intense sun. So that's the flavor component. I hope that was helpful. It's a moving target, and there'll be more research in the coming years, and this will grow. But when you talk to home gardeners, they're trying to optimize for flavor. And let me just hit one last point. What's the best time to eat a tomato? Right after you pick it. That is the peak of its flavor. Now, its color may change if you leave it on a shelf, but its flavor is declining. So what you want to do is you don't want to refrigerate tomatoes. You want to pick them and eat them as soon as possible. So the time from plant to table, the shorter that is, the higher the flavor. So common tomato problems. We have environmental disorders. We have blossom end rot, cat facing, fruit cracks, sun scald, tomato leaf roll. We have a host of diseases, and then we have pests. What you all need to do as master gardeners is teach people how to use IPM. Because if they just keep coming back to you over and over again, wanting you to answer their questions, then we've failed. What we really need to do is empower people to go to IPM, click on the home and garden section, pick the vegetable that we're looking at, and then get the answers to their questions. Now, let me go back. What's important is for each one of these, if you're taking a sustainable gardening approach, what you're trying to do is minimize pesticide and herbicide use and maximize sustainable gardening practices. So in IPM, it will say non-chemical management and chemical management. Start in the non-chemical and walk people through doing that first before trying chemical. So I hope this was helpful. If you need further resources, they're at the back of the book, particularly for the flavor component. And I hope you have a great summer growing tomatoes in Mill Valley and the rest of Marin County. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.